April 1945, Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. British soldiers of the 11th Armored Division pushed open the gates and confronted a vision of hell itself. 60,000 skeletal prisoners, 13,000 unburied corpses rotting in the spring sun, and the stench of death so overwhelming that hardened veterans vomited into their helmets. Among the living dead stood the perpetrators, SS guards, who had orchestrated this industrial-scale murder. The liberated prisoners, many barely able to stand, surged forward with a single, primal demand. "Give us the guards. Just 5 minutes. That's all we ask." But Captain Derek Sington of the British Army stood between vengeance and justice. His service revolver raised not at the SS, but at the crowd of survivors. What happened next would define the very soul of British military honor and challenge every notion of justice in the face of unspeakable evil. The survivors would never forgive him. History would vindicate him, and the moral dilemma he faced would haunt the conscience of a nation for generations. The spring of 1945 should have been a season of renewal across Europe. Instead, as the British Second Army drove deep into the heart of Germany, it uncovered a landscape of systematic annihilation that defied every principle upon which British civilization had been built. The soldiers of the 11th Armored Division, veterans of Normandy, hardened by the Ardennes, men who had seen the worst of modern warfare, believed themselves prepared for anything. They were catastrophically wrong. On 15th of April 1945, reconnaissance units approaching the town of Bergen, Lower Saxony, encountered something that their training manuals had never addressed. The smell reached them first, a nauseating miasma of decomposition, excrement, and disease that carried for miles on the wind. Sergeant John Bates of the Royal Artillery later recalled, "We thought it was a chemical works that had been bombed. The stench was unlike anything in nature. It was the smell of industrialized death." As they crested the final ridge, the camp came into view, a sprawling complex of wooden huts surrounded by barbed wire, with smoke rising from what appeared to be open pits. The strategic context was critical. By April 1945, the Third Reich was in its death throes. The Red Army was fighting street by street through Berlin. American forces had crossed the Rhine and were racing eastward. The British 21st Army Group, under Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, was driving toward the Baltic to cut off German forces in Denmark and prevent a potential Alpine redoubt in southern Germany. The liberation of concentration camps was not a primary military objective. It was an unavoidable consequence of the advance, and one for which the British Army was utterly unprepared. Bergen-Belsen had not begun as an extermination camp. Originally established in 1940 as a prisoner of war camp, it had been redesignated in 1943 as a holding camp for Jews who might be exchanged for German nationals held abroad. But as the Nazi regime collapsed and camps in the east were evacuated ahead of the Soviet advance, Bergen-Belsen became a dumping ground for tens of thousands of prisoners force-marched westward. By early 1945, the camp designed for 10,000 held over 60,000 souls in conditions that transcended mere brutality and entered the realm of systematic extermination through neglect. The dilemma that would soon confront British officers was rooted in a fundamental clash of values. The British Army prided itself on adherence to the Geneva Conventions, on the principle that even in total war, certain lines must not be crossed. The concept of fair play, so often mocked by Britain's enemies as naive, was nevertheless a cornerstone of British military identity. Officers were trained that the moment an enemy surrendered, he became a prisoner of war entitled to protection. This principle had been tested throughout the war, but never as it would be at Bergen-Belsen. Captain Derek Sington, a 34-year-old intelligence officer attached to the 11th Armored Division, was among the first to enter the camp. A Cambridge-educated linguist who had served in North Africa and Italy, Sington embodied the best of British officer tradition, educated, principled, and possessed of an unshakable belief in the rule of law. His orders were clear: secure the camp, assess the situation, and maintain order. Nothing in his training had prepared him for what awaited. The initial reconnaissance on 15th of April revealed a situation beyond comprehension. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonin, commanding the 11th Light Field Ambulance, recorded in his diary, "The camp was a sea of mud. In it were the bodies of the dead, some partially clothed, some naked. Among them moved the living, who looked like walking skeletons. Many were too weak to move. They simply lay where they had fallen, waiting to die." They, the SS guards, approximately 80 in number, had remained at their posts under a local truce negotiated to prevent the spread of typhus. They stood in their immaculate uniforms, a grotesque contrast to the human wreckage surrounding them. The British soldiers' initial reaction was one of stunned incomprehension, followed rapidly by a rage so profound that it threatened to overwhelm military discipline. Corporal Peter Coombs of the Royal Engineers later testified, "We wanted to kill them all. Every single one of those SS bastards. We'd seen combat, we'd seen our mates die, but this was different. This was murder on a scale we couldn't comprehend. And they just stood there as if they'd done nothing wrong." The prisoners' reaction to their liberators was equally complex. Many were too weak to respond at all. Others, in the grip of typhus-induced delirium, didn't comprehend that liberation had come. But among those who retained their faculties, a terrible clarity emerged. They wanted vengeance, and they wanted it immediately. Survivors later recounted that within hours of the British arrival, groups of prisoners began identifying specific guards who had been particularly brutal. Lists were compiled. Plans were whispered in Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, and Dutch. The consensus was unanimous. The SS must die, and die painfully. The strategic challenge facing British command was unprecedented. Brigadier Hugh Llewellyn, Glyn Hughes, the Deputy Director of Medical Services for the Second Army, arrived on 17th of April to assess the medical crisis. His report to Montgomery was stark. "This is the most horrible, frightful place I have ever seen. The conditions are indescribable. We have 60,000 people, of whom at least 30,000 will die regardless of what we do. We have a typhus epidemic that could spread to our own troops and the civilian population, and we have a powder keg of vengeance that could explode at any moment." The British response revealed the characteristic national approach to crisis: methodical, organized, and determined to impose order on chaos. Within 48 hours, the Royal Army Medical Corps had established field hospitals. The Royal Engineers began bulldozing mass graves and improving sanitation. The Royal Artillery set up kitchens to provide food, carefully calibrated, as the medical officers quickly learned that feeding starving people too quickly could kill them, and military police units were deployed to maintain order, which meant, crucially, protecting the SS guards from the prisoners they had tormented. This last measure provoked the first serious confrontation. On 18th of April, a group of approximately 200 male prisoners, led by a Polish Jew named Mordecai Anielewicz, no relation to the Warsaw Ghetto fighter, approached the compound where the SS guards were being held. They were armed with clubs, stones, and a few knives fashioned from scrap metal. Their demand was simple: hand over the guards for people's justice. Captain Sington, backed by a platoon of the Rifle Brigade, blocked their path. The confrontation that followed would become legendary in the oral histories of Bergen-Belsen survivors, though accounts vary wildly in detail. What is certain is that Sington, speaking in German and broken Yiddish, attempted to explain that the guards were now prisoners of war and would face trial. The response, shouted by multiple voices, was a variation of, "Trial! They gave us no trial. They murdered our children, our parents. Give them to us." Sington's response, recorded in his own memoir published in 1946, was carefully calibrated. "I understand your anger. I have seen what they did. But we are British soldiers, and we do not murder prisoners. These men will face justice, British justice. They will hang, I promise you that. But they will hang after a proper trial, not torn apart by a mob. That is what separates us from them." The crowd did not disperse peacefully. It took the arrival of additional troops, the firing of warning shots over the crowd's heads, and ultimately the personal intervention of Brigadier Hughes, who addressed the prisoners in German, acknowledging their suffering and promising that justice would be served. to defuse the immediate crisis. But it was only the first of many such confrontations. The moral complexity of the situation was not lost on the British soldiers. Private Harold Ledruy-Laennec, himself a survivor of Bergen-Belsen, he had been imprisoned for resistance activities in Jersey, later wrote, "I was in an impossible position. I was a British soldier, but I was also a former prisoner. I understood both sides. The survivors wanted blood. They'd earned it. But I also understood that if we let them have their vengeance, we'd be no better than the Nazis. We'd be saying that the rule of law only applies when it's convenient." The SS guards themselves presented a study in moral bankruptcy. During interrogations conducted by British intelligence officers, including Sington, they displayed a consistent pattern of denial and deflection. Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer, the camp commandant known as the Beast of Belsen, insisted he was merely following orders and that the conditions had deteriorated due to circumstances beyond his control. Irma Gress, a 22-year-old guard notorious for her sadism, claimed she had only been doing her duty. Not one expressed genuine remorse. The statistical reality of Bergen-Belsen was staggering. British medical officers estimated that between January and April 1945 alone, approximately 35,000 people had died in the camp, an average of 292 deaths per day. In the 2 weeks following liberation, despite the best efforts of British medical teams, another 14,000 would die, their bodies too ravaged by starvation and disease to recover. The total death toll at Bergen-Belsen over its operational life exceeded 50,000 souls. The British public, meanwhile, remained largely unaware of the full horror. The BBC had reported the liberation, and some newspaper accounts had appeared, but wartime censorship and the sheer incredulity of the reports meant that most Britons could not fully grasp what had been discovered. That would change dramatically when film crews arrived and began documenting the camp in detail. The footage, later compiled into the documentary German Concentration Camps Factual Survey, would shock the world. But in April 1945, the soldiers on the ground were confronting the reality alone. As the first week of liberation drew to a close, the fundamental tension had crystallized into a clear dilemma. The survivors demanded immediate, violent justice. The SS guards claimed the protection of international law. And the British Army, representing a nation that prided itself on civilized values, stood in the middle. Captain Sington, increasingly exhausted and emotionally devastated by what he witnessed daily, understood that this was not merely a question of military discipline. It was a test of whether British principles could survive contact with absolute evil. The stage was set for a confrontation that would force everyone involved to confront the most fundamental questions of justice, vengeance, and what it truly meant to be civilized in the face of industrialized barbarism. The British Army's response to Bergen-Belsen in the days following liberation revealed both the strengths and limitations of military organization when confronted with a humanitarian catastrophe of unprecedented scale. The challenge was not merely logistical, though the logistics were nightmarish, but fundamentally moral. How does one maintain the rule of law when every instinct screams for vengeance and when the perpetrators stand unrepentant amid the evidence of their crimes? By 20th of April 1945, the British had established a command structure specifically for Bergen-Belsen. Brigadier Glyn Hughes assumed overall control, with Lieutenant Colonel James Johnston appointed as camp commandant. Captain Sington headed the intelligence section, responsible for interrogating SS personnel and documenting war crimes. The Royal Army Medical Corps deployed over 100 doctors and 500 nurses, supplemented by medical students from London teaching hospitals who volunteered for what was euphemistically termed special duty. The scale of the operation was immense. This was not merely a military occupation, but an attempt to resurrect the dead and restrain the living from becoming executioners. The physical environment remained hellish. The April weather turned wet and cold, transforming the camp into a quagmire of mud and human waste. The water supply was contaminated. Typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis, and dysentery raged unchecked. The British engineers worked around the clock to improve sanitation, but the camp's infrastructure had been designed for temporary detention, not long-term habitation by tens of thousands. Every decision involved impossible trade-offs. Resources devoted to burying the dead meant fewer resources for treating the living. Isolating the contagious meant leaving others in squalor. Feeding the starving required careful medical supervision that was in desperately short supply. The SS Guards, now numbering 48 men and 32 women, after some had fled before the British arrival, were housed in a separate compound under armed guard. The irony was not lost on anyone. British soldiers were now protecting the very peoples who had perpetrated the atrocities. The guards were put to work burying the dead, a task that British soldiers found grimly satisfying, forcing the perpetrators to handle the corpses of their victims. Newsreel footage from this period shows SS Guards, still in their uniforms, dragging bodies to mass graves, while British soldiers with fixed bayonets stand watch. The images would become iconic, but they also inflamed tensions within the camp. The survivors' demand for immediate justice intensified as they regained strength. On 22 April, a group of approximately 50 prisoners, led by a Hungarian Jew named Tibor Klein, who had been a lawyer before the war, presented Captain Sington with a formal petition. Written in careful German on paper, scrounged from British supplies, it demanded that the SS Guards be handed over to a People's Tribunal composed of survivors. The document was remarkably legalistic, citing precedents from revolutionary France and arguing that crimes of such magnitude transcended normal judicial processes. Klein's argument was sophisticated. The SS had placed themselves outside the protection of law by their actions. Therefore, the survivors had a natural right to exact justice. Sington's response, documented in his intelligence reports, was equally legalistic but rooted in British military law and the Geneva Conventions. He explained that the guards, having surrendered, were prisoners of war entitled to protection until they could be tried by proper courts-martial or international tribunals. He acknowledged the survivors' suffering, but insisted that vengeance was not justice. The meeting ended without resolution, but with Klein warning, "Captain, you are a good man, but you do not understand. We have been to hell. We have seen our families murdered. If you will not give us justice, we will take it." The threat was not idle. On the night of 23rd of April, 3 SS Guards were found severely beaten in their compound. 2 required hospitalization. The perpetrators had somehow breached the security perimeter, administered the beatings, and escaped without detection. British military police launched an investigation, but the survivor community closed ranks. No one had seen anything. No one knew anything. The message was clear. If official justice would not be served, unofficial justice would be. The incident forced a crisis meeting of British command. Brigadier Hughes, Lieutenant Colonel Johnston, Captain Sington, and the senior medical officers convened to address what was rapidly becoming a breakdown of order. The discussion, recorded in meeting minutes, now held at the Imperial War Museum, revealed the depth of the moral dilemma. Major John Harding of the Royal Military Police argued for stricter security and threatened prosecution of anyone who attacked the guards. Major Mervyn Gonnan of the Medical Corps countered that prosecuting survivors for attacking their tormentors would be morally indefensible and practically impossible. No British court would convict them. Captain Sington proposed a middle course: accelerate the documentation of war crimes and make clear to the survivors that justice would be swift and certain, thereby removing the motivation for vigilante action. Brigadier Hughes made the final decision, and it reflected the characteristic British approach: double down on procedure and transparency. The SS Guards would be formally charged with war crimes within 48 hours. The charges would be read publicly in the camp in multiple languages so that survivors could hear that justice was in motion. A military court would be convened at the earliest possible date, and security around the guards would be increased, not decreased, because maintaining the rule of law was non-negotiable, even when that law protected monsters. The public reading of charges on 25 April was a carefully orchestrated event. A platform was erected in the main camp square. Loudspeakers were set up, Interpreters stood ready to translate into German, Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, Dutch, and French. Thousands of survivors, many still skeletal and weak, gathered to hear. Captain Sington, flanked by military police, read the charges against Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer and 44 other SS personnel. The list of crimes was extensive: murder, torture, systematic starvation, medical experimentation, and crimes against humanity. The crowd's reaction was complex. There was applause, but also shouts of anger. Many survivors were satisfied that justice was proceeding. Others remained skeptical, shouting questions. How long would the trials take? Would the defendants be allowed lawyers? What if they were acquitted? Sington addressed each concern, explaining that British military justice was thorough but fair, that the evidence was overwhelming, and that conviction was certain. He concluded with a statement that would be remembered by many survivors. These people will face British justice. That means they will have a fair trial, but it also means they will hang. I give you my word as a British officer. Not everyone was convinced. That evening, a delegation of survivors, including several who had been prominent in resistance movements within the camp, met privately with Sington. Their spokesman, a Polish Jew named Samuel Goldberg, who had survived 3 years in various camps, made a passionate argument. "Captain, you speak of justice, but you do not understand what justice means to us. We watched our children thrown into fires. We watched our parents shot for sport. We were beaten, starved, worked to death. And now you tell us we must wait for trials? That we must trust British courts? We have no faith in courts. We have faith only in our own hands." Sington's response, recorded in his personal diary, revealed his own internal struggle. "I told them I understood their anger, but that I would not, allow mob justice. I explained that if we descended to the level of our enemies, we would lose the very thing we had been fighting for, the principle that human life has value and that even the guilty deserve a fair trial." Goldberg looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and said, "You are a good man, Captain, but you are naive. There is no fairness in this world. There is only power and vengeance." I had no answer for him. The tension between British military discipline and survivor rage was further complicated by the practical realities of camp administration. The British had decided to use some of the less culpable SS guards, primarily administrative personnel, who had not been directly involved in atrocities, to help manage the camp's logistics. This decision, made purely for practical reasons, these individuals knew where supplies were stored, understood the camp's systems, and could communicate with German civilians in the area, was deeply offensive to many survivors. The sight of SS personnel, even those not charged with serious crimes, walking freely under British protection, was intolerable. On 28th April, the situation nearly exploded. A group of survivors cornered an SS administrative clerk named Hans Muller in one of the camp's storage areas. Muller had not been charged with war crimes. His role had been purely clerical. But to the survivors, he wore the SS uniform and therefore bore collective guilt. They beat him severely before British military police intervened. The rescue of Muller required the use of force. Several survivors were injured when military police used rifle butts to break up the attack. The aftermath of this incident brought the fundamental conflict into sharp relief. The injured survivors were treated by British medical personnel who were torn between their duty to care for all patients and their personal revulsion at having to protect SS guards. Corporal Mary Sands, a nurse with the Queen Alexandra's Imperial Military Nursing Service, wrote in a letter home, "We are treating people who tried to kill the very monsters we're supposed to be protecting. It makes no sense. My head tells me we must follow the rules, but my heart says, let them have their revenge. I don't know what's right anymore." Captain Sington, increasingly exhausted and emotionally drained, requested a meeting with Brigadier Hughes to discuss the sustainability of the current policy. His argument, laid out in a memorandum dated 29th April, was pragmatic. The British simply did not have enough troops to maintain constant vigilance over both the guards and the survivors. Every soldier assigned to guard duty was a soldier not available for the massive humanitarian effort. Moreover, the moral cost of protecting SS guards was damaging to troop morale. Soldiers who had liberated the camp were now being asked to prevent survivors from exacting vengeance, and many were questioning their orders. Hugh's response was unequivocal and revealed the depth of British commitment to principle even in the face of practical difficulties. "Captain Singleton, I understand your concerns and I share them, but we are British soldiers, and we do not compromise on the rule of law. If we need more troops, we'll get more troops. If we need to work our men harder, we'll work them harder. But we will not, under any circumstances, allow mob justice. That is not who we are. That is not what we fought this war for." The conversation reflected a fundamental truth about British military culture. The commitment to fair play and the rule of law was not merely rhetorical, but deeply embedded in institutional identity. This commitment had been tested throughout the war, in the treatment of German POWs, in the rules of engagement for Bomber Command, in the conduct of operations in occupied territories, but never as severely as at Bergen-Belsen. Here, the principle collided directly with the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Perpetrators of industrialized murder standing amid their victims, protected by the very army that had liberated those victims. The British solution was characteristically bureaucratic. More documentation, more procedure, more structure. War crimes investigators arrived in greater numbers, taking thousands of statements from survivors. Photographers and film crews documented every aspect of the camp. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, which was precisely the point. The trials, when they came, would be so thoroughly documented that no one could question the verdicts. But documentation took time, and time was the one thing the survivors felt they did not have. Many were dying daily despite British medical care. Others were being prepared for repatriation or resettlement. There was a pervasive sense that if justice did not come soon, it would not come at all. This urgency fueled increasingly desperate plans among survivor groups to take matters into their own hands. By the end of April, British intelligence had identified at least 3 separate conspiracies among survivors to kill SS guards. One group planned to poison the guards' food, another intended to set fire to their compound at night. A third, more sophisticated plan involved overpowering the British guards during a shift change and executing the SS personnel before reinforcements could arrive. Captain Singleton's intelligence network, which included several survivors who had decided to cooperate with British authorities, uncovered these plots before they could be executed. But each foiled conspiracy only increased the tension. The moral weight of the situation bore heavily on all involved. British soldiers, particularly the younger ones, struggled to understand why they were protecting people who had committed such atrocities. Survivors struggled to understand why their liberators would deny them the vengeance they had dreamed of during years of torment. And officers like Singleton struggled with the knowledge that they were technically correct. The law must be upheld, but emotionally uncertain whether abstract principles of justice could truly address crimes of such magnitude. As May approached, the situation remained volatile. The SS guards were alive and under British protection. The survivors were increasingly organized and determined, and the British Army, representing a nation that prided itself on civilized values, stood in the middle, committed to a principle that was becoming harder to defend with each passing day. The confrontation that would define the moral core of the liberation was approaching, and everyone knew it. While British forces struggled to maintain order at Bergen-Belsen and prevent vigilante justice, a parallel drama unfolded within the SS Guard compound and in the interrogation rooms where British intelligence officers confronted the perpetrators. What emerged was a portrait of moral bankruptcy so profound that it challenged every assumption about human nature and forced the British to confront an uncomfortable truth. The people who had committed these atrocities were not monsters from mythology, but ordinary human beings who had systematically dehumanized their victims to the point where mass murder became routine administration. The interrogations, conducted primarily by Captain Singleton and a team of intelligence officers from the War Crimes Investigation Unit, revealed a consistent pattern of denial, deflection, and moral evasion. Hauptsturmführer Josef Kramer, the camp commandant, proved particularly instructive. A 39-year-old career SS officer who had previously served at Auschwitz, Kramer approached his interrogations with bureaucratic precision. He insisted that he had merely been following orders from higher authority, that the deteriorating conditions at Bergen-Belsen were due to circumstances beyond his control. The influx of prisoners from evacuated eastern camps, the breakdown of supply lines, the chaos of Germany's collapse, and that he had done his best under impossible circumstances. When confronted with the evidence, the thousands of corpses, the skeletal survivors, the testimony of prisoners who described systematic brutality, Kramer's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. In an interrogation transcript dated 28th of April 1945, he stated, "I was a soldier following orders. The camp was overcrowded because of decisions made in Berlin. The food shortages were due to Allied bombing of transportation networks. The typhus epidemic was beyond anyone's control. I did what I could with the resources available." When Sington pointed out that Kramer had personally selected prisoners for execution and had overseen a regime of systematic starvation, Kramer replied, "That is an exaggeration. I was responsible for camp security and administration. Individual deaths were unfortunate, but inevitable given the circumstances." This response, the reduction of mass murder to administrative inconvenience, was characteristic of the SS Guards' defense strategy. They had so thoroughly internalized the Nazi ideology of racial hierarchy that they genuinely did not perceive their victims as fully human. The Jews, Poles, Russians, and others imprisoned at Bergen-Belsen were, in the SS worldview, subhuman elements whose suffering and death were of no more moral consequence than the culling of livestock. This was not a defense they articulated explicitly. They were aware enough to know that such statements would be damning, but it permeated every aspect of their testimony. Irma Griese, the 22-year-old Aufseherin, female guard, who had become notorious among prisoners for her sadism, presented a different but equally disturbing profile. Young, attractive, and utterly remorseless, Griese had joined the SS Auxiliary Service at age 18 and had risen rapidly through the camp system. Survivors testified that she had personally beaten prisoners to death, set dogs on them for entertainment, and selected women for execution with casual indifference. Yet, in her interrogations, Griese presented herself as a victim of circumstance, a young woman who had simply been doing her job in difficult times. British interrogators found Griese particularly difficult to process psychologically. Major Cranfield of the War Crimes Investigation Unit wrote in his report, "Griese displays no remorse whatsoever. She speaks of beating prisoners as if discussing routine paperwork. When confronted with testimony from survivors, she dismisses it as exaggeration or lies. She seems genuinely unable to comprehend that her actions were criminal. It is as if she exists in a parallel moral universe where the normal rules of human conduct simply do not apply." The German military and civilian population in the area surrounding Bergen-Belsen presented yet another dimension of moral complexity. The camp had not been hidden. It was located near a major town, and thousands of German civilians lived within sight and smell of the facility. Yet when British forces questioned local residents, they encountered a wall of denial. No one had known what was happening. No one had seen anything unusual. The smell? Perhaps from a nearby factory. The prisoners? They must have been criminals who deserved their fate. The systematic nature of this denial suggested not ignorance, but willful blindness, a collective decision to not see what was plainly visible. British intelligence officers found this civilian complicity particularly galling. Lieutenant Colonel Leo Genn, an actor in civilian life who had been commissioned for war crimes investigation work, conducted extensive interviews with German civilians. His report, filed on 3 May 1945, was scathing. The German population claims ignorance, but this is transparently false. They saw the prisoners, they smelled the death, they heard the screams. They chose not to know, because knowing would have required them to act, and action would have been dangerous. This is not innocence, but moral cowardice on a national scale. The reaction of German military prisoners of war to the revelations about Bergen-Belsen provided another window into the Nazi mindset. The British had established large POW camps in the area, holding thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers captured during the final offensives. When news of Bergen-Belson's liberation spread, British authorities decided to force German POWs to visit the camp and witness the evidence firsthand. The results were mixed and troubling. Some German soldiers were genuinely shocked and claimed they had no knowledge of the camp system. Others dismissed the evidence as Allied propaganda or exaggeration. A significant number, however, displayed a reaction that British observers found most disturbing. They acknowledged the reality but justified it. These soldiers argued that the prisoners had been enemies of Germany, that war required harsh measures, and that the Allies had no moral standing to judge given their own bombing campaigns against German cities. This moral equivalence, the equation of strategic bombing with systematic genocide, revealed how deeply Nazi ideology had penetrated German military culture. The British response to this German intransigence was characteristically methodical. They documented everything. Photographers and film crews recorded the camp in exhaustive detail. Medical officers compiled statistics on death rates, disease prevalence, and the physical condition of survivors. Survivors were interviewed at length, their testimonies recorded and cross-referenced. The goal was to create an evidentiary record so comprehensive that denial would be impossible. This was not merely about prosecuting the guards at Bergen-Belsen, but about establishing an historical record that would refute any future attempts to minimize or deny the Holocaust. The international dimension added further complexity. By early May, representatives from the newly forming United Nations War Crimes Commission had arrived at Bergen-Belsen. They brought with them a broader perspective on Nazi atrocities. Bergen-Belsen was not unique, but part of a vast system of camps across occupied Europe. The evidence emerging from other liberated camps, Buchenwald, Dachau, Mauthausen, painted a picture of industrialized murder on a scale that defied comprehension. The question facing the Allies was not merely how to punish the perpetrators, but how to establish a legal framework adequate to address crimes of such magnitude. British legal officers grappled with fundamental questions of jurisprudence. Traditional military law was designed to address violations of the laws of war, the mistreatment of POWs, the targeting of civilians, the use of prohibited weapons. But the Nazi camp system represented something qualitatively different, the systematic attempt to exterminate entire populations based on racial ideology. This was not a war crime in the traditional sense, but something new, something that would later be termed crimes against humanity and genocide. The legal framework to address such crimes was still being developed, and Bergen-Belsen was one of the test cases. The SS guards, meanwhile, began to grasp the magnitude of their predicament. Initial confidence that they would be treated as ordinary POWs gave way to the realization that they faced execution. Some attempted to shift blame to superiors or to claim they had been coerced into service. Others maintained their defiant stance, insisting they had done nothing wrong. A few, very few, showed signs of genuine remorse, though British interrogators remained skeptical about whether this remorse was genuine or merely a survival strategy. The psychological toll on British personnel involved in the interrogations was severe. Captain Sington, who conducted hundreds of hours of interviews with SS guards, wrote in his diary, "I find myself struggling to maintain professional detachment. These people speak of murder as if discussing crop yields. They displayed no empathy, no remorse, no recognition that they have done anything wrong. It is as if they are missing some fundamental component of human conscience. I leave each interrogation feeling contaminated, as if their moral bankruptcy is somehow infectious." The survivors, observing the interrogation process from a distance, grew increasingly frustrated. They could see the SS guards being treated with procedural correctness, given food, medical care, legal representation, while they themselves remained in squalid conditions, dying by the hundreds each day despite British medical efforts. The contrast was stark and, to many survivors, intolerable. The British were treating the perpetrators better than the victims, or so it seemed. This perception, while not entirely accurate, the British were working desperately to save survivors, was understandable given the circumstances. The SS guards were housed in relatively clean quarters with adequate food and water. The survivors remained in the disease-ridden camp where conditions, despite British efforts, remained appalling. The optics were terrible, and they fueled the growing determination among survivors to take justice into their own hands. By mid-May, the situation had crystallized into a clear confrontation between two incompatible worldviews. The SS guards, representing a regime that had systematically dehumanized its victims, could not comprehend why they were being prosecuted for actions they considered legitimate. The survivors, having endured years of torment, could not comprehend why their liberators would protect their tormentors. And the British, representing a legal and moral tradition rooted in the rule of law, found themselves defending principles that seemed increasingly abstract in the face of such concrete evil. The stage was set for the confrontation that would test whether British principles could survive contact with the absolute moral bankruptcy of the Nazi regime. The answer would come not in a courtroom, but in a moment of crisis when the survivors' demand for immediate justice collided with the British commitment to due process, and Captain Derek Sington would be forced to make a choice that would define his life and challenge the conscience of a nation. The crisis that had been building since liberation finally erupted on 13th of May 1945, a date that would be seared into the memory of everyone present at Bergen-Belsen. The immediate trigger was prosaic, a bureaucratic delay in the commencement of formal trials, but the underlying cause was the accumulation of weeks of tension, grief, and frustrated rage among survivors who had waited too long for justice they feared would never come. The morning began with rumors spreading through the survivor camp that the trials of SS guards had been postponed indefinitely due to procedural complications. This was not entirely accurate. The trials were delayed by only a few days, while legal officers finalized the charges and ensured all procedural requirements were met. But in the fevered atmosphere of Bergen-Belsen, rumors took on a life of their own. By midday, a crowd of several hundred survivors had gathered near the SS guard compound, and their mood was ugly. Captain Sington, alerted to the gathering by his intelligence network, rushed to the scene with a platoon of military police. What he found was a crowd that had moved beyond anger into something more primal and dangerous. At the front stood a group of men who had been leaders in the camp's underground resistance, individuals who had survived through a combination of cunning, courage, and sheer will. They were not a mob, but an organized force with a clear objective. They intended to breach the compound, seize the SS guards, and execute them immediately. The spokesman for the group was Mordecai Rosenfeld, a Polish Jew who had survived Auschwitz, a death march, and finally Bergen-Belsen. He had lost his wife and 3 children to the gas chambers. He had watched friends beaten to death for minor infractions. He had endured starvation, disease, and systematic dehumanization. And now, standing before Captain Sington, he articulated the survivor's position with devastating clarity. "Captain, we have been patient. We have trusted your promises of justice, but we see the trials delayed. We see the guards fed and housed while we die in this filth. We see British soldiers protecting the very people who murdered our families. We have concluded that your justice is a lie, a way to protect your own conscience while denying us what we have earned through our suffering. We will wait no longer. Stand aside, or we will go through you." Sington's response, delivered in German so that all could understand, was the product of weeks of agonized reflection on the nature of justice and the rule of law. His words, recorded by multiple witnesses and later included in his memoir, represented not just his personal view, but the articulation of a principle that defined British military honor. "Herr Rosenfeld, I understand your anger, and I do not diminish your suffering, but I cannot and will not stand aside. These guards are prisoners of war under British protection. They will face trial, and they will be convicted, and they will hang. But they will hang after due process, not torn apart by a mob. That is what separates civilization from barbarism. That is what we fought this war to preserve. If you proceed, you will have to go through me and these soldiers, and we will use force to stop you. I do not want to do that, but I will if I must. The confrontation that followed lasted nearly 3 hours and came perilously close to violence. The crowd surged forward. British soldiers raised their rifles. Singleton drew his service revolver and fired a warning shot into the air. The crowd halted, but did not disperse. What followed was a tense standoff, punctuated by shouted arguments, emotional appeals, and the arrival of additional British troops who formed a cordon around the SS compound. Brigadier Hughes arrived and attempted to defuse the situation by addressing the crowd directly. His approach was different from Singleton's, less legalistic, more emotional. He acknowledged the survivors' suffering, validated their anger, and made a personal promise. I give you my word as a British officer, and as a human being who has seen what was done to you. These people will face justice. Trials will begin within 1 week. The evidence is overwhelming. They will be convicted. They will be executed. But it will be done properly according to law, so that no one can ever say that justice was not served. I ask you to trust us for 1 more week. If we fail you, then I will understand if you take matters into your own hands. But give us this 1 week. The appeal worked, but barely. The crowd gradually dispersed, but not before several survivors made clear that this was the last reprieve. If the trials did not commence as promised, if the verdicts were not what they expected, if there was any hint of leniency or procedural manipulation, they would act. The message was unambiguous. British authority at Bergen-Belsen hung by a thread. The crisis forced a reckoning within British command. That evening, a heated meeting took place at headquarters involving Brigadier Hughes, Lieutenant Colonel Johnston, Captain Singleton, and senior legal officers. The discussion, recorded in meeting minutes, revealed deep divisions about how to proceed. Major Cranfield of the legal staff argued that the survivors' threat of violence was itself a crime and should be prosecuted. Captain Singleton countered that prosecuting survivors for threatening their tormentors would be morally indefensible and practically impossible. Brigadier Hughes made the final decision: accelerate the trial process, ensure maximum transparency, and maintain security at all costs. The week that followed was one of frantic preparation. The trial venue was established in the nearby town of Lüneburg, in a building that had formerly housed a German military court. The symbolism was deliberate. German military justice would be replaced by British military justice, demonstrating the superiority of the rule of law over Nazi barbarism. The charges were finalized. 45 defendants, including Kramer and Griese, would face trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The evidence was compiled into volumes of testimony, photographs, and documentary records, and security at Bergen-Belsen was increased to prevent any last-minute attempts at vigilante justice. But the crisis had revealed a fundamental problem that no amount of procedure could resolve. The survivors' faith in justice had been shattered by their experiences. They had seen the Nazi regime operate with impunity for years. They had watched as the international community failed to intervene. They had endured a system where law meant nothing and power meant everything. Now they were being asked to trust in a legal process conducted by foreigners, in a language many did not speak, according to rules they did not understand. The psychological gulf between British legalism and survivor trauma was vast, and bridging it required more than promises. Captain Singleton, recognizing this, took an unprecedented step. He organized a series of meetings between British legal officers and survivor representatives, explaining in detail how the trials would be conducted, what evidence would be presented, and what verdicts were expected. He arranged for survivors to attend the trials as observers. He ensured that testimony would be taken in multiple languages and that survivors would have the opportunity to confront their tormentors in court. These measures were not strictly necessary from a legal standpoint, but they were essential for maintaining order and demonstrating that British justice, while procedurally rigorous, was not indifferent to the survivors' need for vindication. The innovation that emerged from this crisis, the inclusion of victim testimony as a central component of war crimes trials, would have lasting implications. Previous military tribunals had focused primarily on documentary evidence and the testimony of military personnel. The Bergen-Belsen trial would be different. Survivors would take the stand, describe what had been done to them, and confront their tormentors directly. This was not merely about establishing guilt, which was already overwhelming, but about giving voice to the victims and ensuring that their suffering was acknowledged in the historical record. The psychological impact on British personnel during this period was severe. Soldiers who had liberated the camp were now working around the clock to prevent the very people they had saved from committing acts that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Medical staff were treating survivors who openly discussed plans to kill guards. Intelligence officers were monitoring conversations and reporting potential threats, knowing that they were in some sense betraying the trust of people who had already been betrayed too many times. Private Harold Le Drouillenec, the British soldier who was also a Bergen-Belsen survivor, found himself in an impossible position. His fellow soldiers looked to him to explain the survivors' perspective. The survivors looked to him to influence British policy. He satisfied neither group. In a letter to his sister dated 15th of May, he wrote, "I am torn in two. I understand why the survivors want blood. I wanted it myself when I was imprisoned here. But I also understand why we cannot allow it. If we let them become executioners, we validate the Nazi claim that there is no real difference between us and them, that everyone descends to barbarism when given the chance. We must prove them wrong, even if it costs us the goodwill of the very people we liberated." The crisis also revealed the limitations of military authority in the face of moral absolutes. British soldiers could prevent violence through superior force, but they could not compel belief in the justice system. They could protect the SS guards physically, but they could not protect them from the moral condemnation that permeated every aspect of the camp. The guards themselves, observing the confrontation, finally began to grasp the depth of hatred they had engendered and the precariousness of their situation. Several attempted to negotiate with British authorities for transfer to POW camps in Britain, arguing that they would not survive in Germany once British protection was withdrawn. Their requests were denied. As the promised trial date approached, the tension at Bergen-Belsen remained palpable. The survivors had agreed to wait, but their patience was exhausted. The British had committed to swift justice, but they remained bound by procedural requirements that seemed maddeningly slow to those demanding vengeance. And the SS guards, finally understanding that they would face execution, oscillated between defiance and despair. The crisis of 13th of May had been averted, but it had fundamentally altered the dynamic at Bergen-Belsen. The survivors now understood that British justice, while real, operated according to principles that prioritized procedure over emotion. The British now understood that their commitment to the rule of law, while morally defensible, was not universally appreciated by those it was meant to serve. And everyone understood that the upcoming trials would be not merely a legal proceeding, but a test of whether the principles of civilization could survive contact with the absolute evil of the Nazi regime. Captain Sington, reflecting on the confrontation in his diary, wrote, "Today I pointed a gun at people who had every right to their rage. I stood between victims and perpetrators and told the victims they could not have the vengeance they had earned through years of suffering. I did this because I believe in the rule of law, because I believe that civilization requires us to be better than our enemies, because I believe that justice must be more than revenge. But I am not certain I was right. I am not certain that abstract principles of law can truly address crimes of such magnitude. I only know that I did what I believed to be my duty, and I will live with the consequences." The trial would begin in 1 week. The world would watch, and the question of whether British justice could adequately address the horrors of Bergen-Belsen would finally be answered. The trial of Josef Kramer and 44 other defendants opened on 17th of September 1945 in Lüneburg, a medieval town 30 miles from Bergen-Belsen. The delay from the promised May start date had been necessary to complete the massive evidentiary preparation, but it had tested the survivors' patience to breaking point. Only the visible progress, the formal charges, the assembly of witnesses, the construction of the courtroom had prevented another crisis. Now, finally, the moment of legal reckoning had arrived. The courtroom was a former German military facility, deliberately chosen for its symbolism. British military police stood guard at every entrance. The public gallery was filled with survivors, journalists from around the world, and representatives of the newly forming United Nations. The defendants sat in 2 rows, still wearing their SS uniforms, a controversial decision meant to ensure clear identification, flanked by British military guards. At the front, a panel of 5 British military officers served as judges, with Major General Horatio Birney Ficklin presiding. Prosecution was led by Colonel T.M. Backhouse, a barrister in civilian life, assisted by a team of military legal officers. The defense was provided by British and Polish military lawyers, a provision that surprised many survivors but reflected the British commitment to procedural fairness. The opening statement by Colonel Backhouse was devastating in its simplicity. He did not engage in rhetorical flourishes or emotional appeals. Instead, he methodically laid out the evidence: the death toll at Bergen-Belsen, the systematic starvation, the deliberate withholding of medical care, the beatings and executions, and the defendants' roles in perpetrating these crimes. He presented photographs of the camp as liberated, film footage of the mass graves, and statistical analyses of death rates. The evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable, but it was the testimony of survivors that transformed the trial from a legal proceeding into a moral reckoning. Over the course of 54 days, more than 100 survivors took the stand. They described in excruciating detail what had been done to them and what they had witnessed. They identified specific defendants and recounted specific acts of cruelty. They spoke in multiple languages: German, Yiddish, Polish, Hungarian, Dutch, with interpreters translating for the court. And they did so with a dignity and courage that moved even the most hardened observers. One of the most powerful testimonies came from Adabimko, a Polish Jewish doctor who had been imprisoned at Auschwitz and then Bergen-Belsen. He described the medical experiments, the selections for execution, and the systematic murder of children. When asked to identify Irma Grese, she pointed directly at the defendant and said, "That woman personally selected my sister for the gas chamber. She did it with a smile. She enjoyed it." Grese, sitting in the dock, showed no emotion. The testimony of Anita Lasker-Wallfish, a young cellist who had survived Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen, provided another dimension. She described the camp orchestra, forced to play music while prisoners were marched to their deaths. She recounted the psychological torture of being made to perform for the entertainment of guards who were simultaneously murdering her fellow prisoners. Her testimony was not about physical brutality, but about the systematic destruction of human dignity, and it was all the more powerful for its restraint. The defense strategy, such as it was, relied primarily on the following orders argument. Defense counsel argued that the defendants had been soldiers in a military system, that they had no choice but to obey commands from higher authority, and that they should not be held individually responsible for the policies of the Nazi regime. This argument, which would later be definitively rejected at the Nuremberg trials, was already losing credibility at Lüneburg. Prosecution countered with evidence that many of the defendants had exceeded their orders, that they had shown initiative in cruelty, and that they had choices at every step. Joseph Kramer's testimony was particularly revealing. He maintained his bureaucratic defense, insisting that he had done his best under impossible circumstances. When confronted with testimony from survivors about his personal involvement in selections and executions, he claimed not to remember specific incidents. When shown photographs of the camp's conditions, he argued that they were the result of circumstances beyond his control. His testimony was technically coherent, but morally bankrupt, and it convinced no one. Irma Grese's testimony was even more disturbing. She denied all accusations of personal cruelty, claiming that survivors were lying or exaggerating. When confronted with multiple witnesses who described identical incidents of brutality, she suggested they had conspired to frame her. She showed no remorse, no acknowledgement of wrongdoing, no recognition that her actions had been criminal. The contrast between her youth and beauty and her utter moral emptiness was profoundly unsettling to observers. The trial also addressed the broader question of collective guilt. The prosecution argued that the defendants were not isolated criminals, but representatives of a system that had industrialized murder. They presented evidence of the vast network of concentration camps, the bureaucratic machinery that had facilitated the Holocaust, and the complicity of German society. This was not merely about punishing individuals, but about establishing a historical record that would refute any future attempts to deny or minimize what had occurred. The survivors who attended the trial had mixed reactions. Many found the process cathartic, the opportunity to confront their tormentors in a public forum, to have their suffering acknowledged and recorded, to see the defendants held accountable. Others found it frustrating, the slow pace of legal procedure, the defense's attempts to cast doubt on survivor testimony, the clinical language that seemed inadequate to describe the horror they had endured, and some found it insufficient. No verdict, no sentence, could truly balance the scales of justice for crimes of such magnitude. Captain Sington, who attended much of the trial as a witness and observer, reflected on its significance in his memoir. The trial was necessary, but it was also inadequate. How does one prosecute industrialized murder? How does one assign individual guilt for collective crimes? How does one sentence people for actions that transcend normal categories of criminality? The legal system was designed for ordinary crimes, theft, assault, even murder. But this was something different, something that required new legal concepts and new moral frameworks. We did our best. I am not certain that justice, in any meaningful sense, was truly served. The verdicts, delivered on 17th November 1945, were swift and unequivocal. Joseph Kramer, guilty, sentenced to death by hanging. Irma Gries, guilty, sentenced to death by hanging. Of the 45 defendants, 11 were sentenced to death. 19 received prison sentences ranging from life to 1 year, and 14 were acquitted for lack of evidence of personal involvement in specific crimes. The acquittals were controversial. Many survivors believed that anyone who had served at Bergen-Belsen bore collective guilt, but they demonstrated the British commitment to individual culpability and evidentiary standards. The executions were carried out on 13th of December 1945 at Hameln Prison. The condemned were hanged by Albert Pierrepoint, Joachim, Britain's chief executioner, who later described the experience as the most difficult of his career. Joseph Kramer went to the gallows maintaining his innocence, insisting to the end that he had merely followed orders. Irma Gries, 22 years old, showed no emotion and spoke no final words. The executions were witnessed by British military officials, representatives of the United Nations, and a small group of survivors who had requested to attend. The reaction among survivors was complex. Many felt a sense of vindication. Justice had been served, the perpetrators had been punished, and the world had acknowledged what had been done. Others felt that the punishment was inadequate. A quick death by hanging seemed insufficient for people who had inflicted years of torment, and some felt empty. No verdict, no execution, could bring back the dead or undo the trauma of what they had endured. The broader impact of the Bergen-Belsen trial was profound. It established precedents that would be used at Nuremberg and subsequent war crimes trials. It demonstrated that individuals could be held accountable for crimes committed under orders. It gave voice to victims and established their testimony as central to the historical record. And it affirmed, in the face of unprecedented evil, that the rule of law could and must be maintained even when every instinct cried out for vengeance. But the trial also revealed the limitations of legal justice in addressing crimes of such magnitude. The defendants who were executed died quickly and relatively painlessly, while their victims had suffered for years. The defendants who received prison sentences would eventually be released, while the survivors would carry their trauma for life. The legal system could punish individuals, but it could not undo the past or fully heal the wounds of the Holocaust. Captain Derek Sington, reflecting on the entire experience years later, wrote, "I stood between vengeance and justice at Bergen-Belsen, and I chose justice. I believed then, and I believe now, that it was the right choice. But I also understand why the survivors wanted vengeance. They had earned it through their suffering. They had every moral right to it. I denied them that right because I believed in a principle that civilization requires us to be better than our enemies, that justice must be more than revenge, that the rule of law must be maintained even in the face of absolute evil. Whether I was right, history will judge. I only know that I did what I believed to be my duty, and I have lived with the consequences ever since. The Bergen-Belsen trial concluded, but its legacy endured. It established that even in the aftermath of total war, even in the face of crimes that defied comprehension, the principles of justice and due process must be maintained. It demonstrated that British military honor was not merely rhetorical, but a lived commitment, even when that commitment required protecting the guilty from the rage of the innocent. And it posed a question that remains relevant today. In the face of absolute evil, is the rule of law sufficient, or does justice sometimes require something more? The liberation of Bergen-Belsen and the subsequent trial of its perpetrators marked a turning point not merely in the prosecution of war crimes, but in humanity's understanding of justice itself. The events of April through December 1945 forced a reckoning with questions that had no easy answers. What does justice mean in the face of industrialized murder? Can legal procedure adequately address crimes that transcend normal categories of criminality? And what is the proper balance between the rule of law and the legitimate demands of victims for vindication? The immediate aftermath of the trial saw the dispersal of Bergen-Belsen survivors across the globe. Some returned to their home countries only to find that their families had been murdered and their communities destroyed. Others emigrated to Palestine, soon to become Israel, Britain, the United States, Canada, and Australia, carrying with them the trauma of what they had endured and the complex legacy of their liberation. Many harbored ambivalent feelings about the British role at Bergen-Belsen, gratitude for liberation mixed with resentment over the protection afforded to SS guards and the perceived inadequacy of the legal proceedings. Captain Derek Sington returned to civilian life in Britain, resuming his career as an academic and writer. He published his memoir, The Offender's Society and the Atrocious Crime, in 1957, in which he reflected extensively on his experiences at Bergen-Belsen. The book was well received critically, but generated controversy among survivor communities, some of whom felt that Sington had been too sympathetic to the principle of due process and insufficiently attentive to the survivors' need for immediate justice. Sington engaged with these criticisms thoughtfully, acknowledging the tension between legal principle and moral urgency, but maintaining that the rule of law had to be upheld even in the most extreme circumstances. The broader impact on British military doctrine and legal practice was significant. The Bergen-Belsen experience informed the development of protocols for dealing with liberated concentration camps, the treatment of war criminals, and the balance between military necessity and humanitarian obligation. The British Army's commitment to maintaining order and preventing vigilante justice, even at the cost of protecting perpetrators, became a case study in military ethics taught at Sandhurst and other military academies. The principle that emerged, that adherence to the rule of law is not merely a procedural nicety, but a fundamental component of military honor, became embedded in British military culture. The legal legacy was equally profound. The Bergen-Belsen trial, along with the larger Nuremberg proceedings, established the principle of individual criminal responsibility for crimes against humanity. The following order's defense was definitively rejected. The concept of crimes so heinous that they transcended national sovereignty and could be prosecuted by international tribunals was established. These principles would later be incorporated into the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and eventually the Rome Statute that created the International Criminal Court. But the moral questions remained unresolved. In the decades following the war, historians, philosophers, and legal scholars debated whether the British approach at Bergen-Belsen had been correct. Some argued that Sington and his colleagues had upheld the highest principles of civilization, by refusing to allow mob justice, even when the mob had every moral justification. Others contended that the survivors' demand for immediate vengeance was legitimate, that crimes of such magnitude placed the perpetrators outside the protection of law, and that the British commitment to procedure had prioritized abstract principle over concrete justice. The survivors themselves held diverse views. Some, like Ada Bimco, who became a prominent advocate for Holocaust education, praised the British for maintaining order and ensuring that the perpetrators faced formal trial. She argued that the legal proceedings, however imperfect, had given survivors a voice and established an historical record that could not be denied. Others, like Mordecai Rosenfeld, who emigrated to Israel and became active in survivor organizations, remained bitter about the British protection of SS guards. He argued until his death in 1987 that the survivors had earned the right to exact their own justice, and that the British had denied them that right out of misplaced legalism. The physical site of Bergen-Belsen became a memorial and museum, preserved as a testament to the horrors of the Holocaust and the importance of remembrance. The British military cemetery nearby contains the graves of soldiers who died during the liberation and relief efforts, a reminder of the cost of confronting such evil. The juxtaposition of the memorial to victims and the cemetery for liberators serves as a powerful symbol of the complex legacy of Bergen-Belsen. The broader question of how societies should deal with mass atrocities remained relevant long after 1945. The Bergen-Belsen experience informed approaches to justice in the aftermath of genocides in Cambodia, Rwanda, the former Yugoslavia, and elsewhere. The tension between retributive justice, punishment of perpetrators, and restorative justice, healing of victims and communities, that was so evident at Bergen-Belsen continued to shape international criminal law and transitional justice mechanisms. In Britain, the memory of Bergen-Belsen became part of the national narrative about the Second World War. The liberation of the camp was presented as evidence of British moral superiority over Nazi barbarism, and the commitment to due process for SS guards was held up as an example of British adherence to principle even in the most extreme circumstances. This narrative was not without its critics, who pointed out that Britain had done little to prevent the Holocaust while it was occurring, and that the commitment to legal procedure had come at the cost of denying survivors their rightful vengeance. Captain Sington's personal legacy was complex. He was respected by many as a man who had upheld the rule of law in the face of tremendous pressure. But he was also criticized by some survivors as having been more concerned with abstract principle than with the concrete needs of victims. In his later years, Sington expressed some ambivalence about his actions, acknowledging in interviews that while he believed he had done the right thing, he understood why survivors felt betrayed. He died in 1983, having spent much of his later life engaged in Holocaust education and advocacy for human rights. The question of whether the British approach at Bergen-Belsen was correct ultimately depends on one's view of justice itself. If justice is primarily about adherence to legal procedure, about ensuring that even the guilty receive fair treatment, about maintaining civilized standards even in the face of barbarism, then the British approach was exemplary. If justice is primarily about vindication for victims, about ensuring that punishment is proportionate to crime, about acknowledging that some acts place perpetrators beyond the protection of law, then the British approach was inadequate. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that both perspectives contain truth. The British were right to insist on due process, to refuse to allow mob justice, to maintain the principle that even the guilty deserve a fair trial. This commitment to the rule of law is what distinguishes civilized societies from barbarism. But the survivors were also right to demand immediate justice, to feel that legal procedure was insufficient to address crimes of such magnitude, to believe that they had earned the right to exact vengeance through their suffering. The tension between these two positions is not a failure of either, but a reflection of the inadequacy of any human system of justice to fully address absolute evil. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen and of Captain Singleton's decision to stand between vengeance and justice is thus a legacy of unresolved moral complexity. It reminds us that adherence to principle sometimes requires us to do things that feel wrong, that the rule of law must be maintained even when it protects the guilty, and that justice is not always the same as vengeance. But it also reminds us that legal procedure, however necessary, is not always sufficient to heal the wounds of atrocity, that victims' demands for vindication are legitimate even when they cannot be fully satisfied, and that some crimes are so heinous that no punishment can truly balance the scales. In the end, the story of Bergen-Belsen is not a story with a clear moral or a simple lesson. It is a story about the collision between principle and emotion, between law and vengeance, between the demands of civilization and the legitimate rage of victims. It is a story about good people forced to make impossible choices in the face of absolute evil. And it is a story that continues to resonate today, whenever societies must grapple with the aftermath of mass atrocities and the question of how to achieve justice when traditional legal frameworks seem inadequate to the task. Captain Derek Singleton stood between vengeance and justice at Bergen-Belsen, and he chose justice. Whether he was right, history has not definitively judged, but his choice and the principles it represented continue to shape our understanding of what it means to be civilized in the face of barbarism, and what it costs to maintain the rule of law when every instinct cries out for revenge. If you found this remarkable story of moral courage and the complexities of justice compelling, please subscribe to our channel for more untold stories from the Second World War. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe Captain Singleton made the right choice? What would you have done in his position? Your perspective matters as we continue to explore the difficult questions that history poses to us all.